Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Coffee. Without it, we would never have had the Industrial Revolution. We'd all be still living in Europe in mud huts. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, the best coffee on the planet. If you can't get to Laredo, you can order from the Organic Man Coffee Trike.shop. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Looking at my geostats, I now have listeners in Russia, Japan, Spain, France, Germany, Poland, Ghana, and Malaysia. These were all added since I did the International Strange Things show. To add some new things to your Halloween deliberations, here are a few stories from some of these countries. In Japan, they have a witch named Yamamba. She approaches her victims looking like a normal woman. Once she has gained their trust, she manages to get invited in for dinner. The witch has a raging appetite, and she begins eating everything in sight. Once all of her victims' possessions are gone, she eats her host as well. On some occasions, Yamamba looks like a field worker. She shows up in a village looking for work. The folks living there feel sorry for this woman, and they allow her to work their fields. Any money she spends in the village is considered to be lucky for whoever gets it. Her true form is as a 7 to 9 foot tall person. Her eyes glow even in the daytime, and her mouth goes from ear to ear. Her teeth are sharp, pointy fangs. As she is seen wearing old, torn-up rags, and if she wishes, she can run faster than is humanly possible. It looks like she's flying. When she disguises her appearance, she might look like a beautiful young woman. Travelers who are passing through an unknown area might come across an inn or a house in the middle of nowhere. There's a room being offered for rent. They go inside, and here's this beautiful young girl standing behind the counter, or she greets them at the door. They get a room for the night. They go in, go to bed. Once they're asleep, Yamanba would slip into the room and devour them. Scholars studying Yamamba say she is the Japanese version of the witch from Hansel and Gretel. Some folks believe the witch came into being in the 19th century as a result of ubasute, the practice by families with scarce resources of abandoning the elderly or the infirm in the Aigakihara forest. I did a whole show on the thing. Aokigakahara forest. You know what I'm talking about, the suicide forest. Unknown hundreds of people died, lost in the sea of trees. Their spirits formed together to become the giant witch. Aokigahara. Why can't I say that when I need to? Oddly enough, today, young girls and a few boys like to dress up as Yamanba. Boy, it's one of those days. It's not Friday the 13th. That was on a Wednesday. They use an excessive amount of makeup to give themselves the wild and appropriate look. They have dark skin tones with white lipstick and a lot, and I do mean a lot, of eyeliner. There's no one style of clothing, so the person is free to interpret their own dress code. It's not just a Halloween thing. Some of them dress up this way all the time. Spain has a lot of haunted locations. They also have some interesting paranormal sites. The Vallecas Case, which took place in Madrid neighborhood in an apartment on Calle Luis Marin number 8. This is one of the more famous cases in Spain involving the paranormal. It is also the first time the authorities recognized a case of paranormal activity. That movie, Veronica, directed by Paco Plaza, was inspired by this story, although the movie doesn't really follow the actual events. The protagonist of the Vallecas case is Estefania Gutierrez Lazaro, a Madrid teenager who lived with her family in the apartment in Vallecas. Estefania began looking into the occult phenomenon as a young girl, as a lot of us did. One day at school, she took part in using a Ouija board. A teacher discovered the girls and tore the Ouija board apart. Some of the girls there that day said that they saw smoke coming from the Ouija board, and Estefania inhaled the smoke. Anytime you're using a Ouija board, it is very important that you close the session and that you send all the spirits back to where they came from. From that moment, the adolescent began to suffer from insomnia, hallucinations, and she was having epileptic seizures. Estefania described a strange human form that came to visit her in the middle of the night. This creature had no face. It was wearing a dark cloak, and it would always ask her to go with him whenever it was the end of the evening. The parents took her to different hospitals, trying to find a reason for her illness, but the doctors were never able to find anything physically wrong. During the final peak of her attacks, on July 13, 1991, Estefania violently attacked her sister, Marianella, who ended up laying on the floor with foam coming from her mouth. The day after, July 14th, Estefania had a serious attack of catalepsy. She was taken to the hospital in a coma, and she died that night. The autopsy failed to find any reason for her death. The examiner said it was sudden and suspicious, but they had no cause. From the moment Estefania died, the paranormal phenomena in the Gutierrez house escalated. The mother would hear Estefania calling her name and begging for help. The sound was almost always coming from the girl's bedroom. The mother also saw a shadowy image of an old man crawling along the walls and the ceiling of the apartment. Doors would open and close by themselves. Glass would shatter for no known reason. Furniture would move from place to place. One night, the mother felt someone touching her hands and her feet. On another night, their younger daughters were violently awakened by some unseen force that was slamming their hands and their arms against the walls of their bedroom. The family would hear pounding on the walls as if someone was trying to break through. November 1st, 1993, 2 years after Estefania had died, her photo that was hanging on the living room wall fell to the floor. When her mother picked the picture up, she screamed and dropped it. The father went to see what was wrong. The photograph had caught fire burning only Estefania's face. The rest of the image and the frame were intact. November 27th, the Gutierrez family called the police to report an unknown intruder was in their apartment. Inspector Jose Negre and his team arrived to find the parents and children outside the house in the rain, terrified. While a couple of officers stayed with the family to question them and start the report, Inspector Negre and two other officers went inside to look for the intruder. As the questioning went on, the whole story began to take shape. Naturally, the police didn't believe there was any kind of paranormal activity until they'd continued their investigation. As the officers were checking some of the rooms, they found a locked wardrobe. The door wouldn't open. As they stood there, the door suddenly swung open violently, and then it slammed shut. The officers tried to open the wardrobe again, only to find the door was locked once more. They heard loud voices coming from the balcony. Looking out through the glass door, they could see there was no one there, but they opened the door anyway just to be sure. There was nobody outside. There was nobody on any balconies across the street that could have been making the sound. As the men were walking through the living room, a crucifix fell from the wall. The crucifix was not damaged, and there was no reason for it to fall to the floor. They looked at the wall. They could see the nail was firmly sticking through the plaster. Right next to the nail, there were claw marks running through the plaster. There were some strange stains on the walls. There was a brown, slimy substance on one of the bedside tables. As stepping into the bathroom, the officers found the temperature was considerably lower than anywhere else in the apartment. The police officers all left the apartment in a hurry. They had decided they were dealing with something far beyond their abilities. The official report written up by Inspector Negre said there was something unnatural causing the disturbances in the Gutierrez apartment. Unable to deal with the paranormal activity anymore, the family sold the place and moved elsewhere. The people who bought the place never reported any kind of unknown or unusual activity. Whatever had been haunting the place either moved on to the next world, or it's waiting for its next victim to come along. When Belmez resident Maria Gomez Pereira noticed a stain forming on her kitchen floor one day in August 1971, little did she realize that she would become the center of one of the most fascinating and best documented cases of paranormal phenomena in Spain. It is known as the Belmez Faces. The stain began to develop over a period of time, and eventually it molded itself into what looked like a face. As it was becoming a recognizable image, the stain seemed to move around the floor, growing darker as it went. Pereira tried to remove the stain several times by scrubbing with all kinds of cleaning products. All of her efforts proved futile. She asked her husband Juan and son Miguel to see if they could do something about the stain, but they were both unable to remove it. The stain was looking more like a horrible face each passing day. The image was causing so much unease that Juan decided they should break up the cement and replace it. He grabbed a pick, and along with Miguel, they began to break up the floor. Once the stained floor was no longer there, Juan poured new concrete into the hole. This should do the trick. About a week later, the stain was back. Now there was no mistaking it's not just a stain. There was a face looking up from the floor. The Pereiras wanted the image gone. It was leading to severe sleeplessness, which was causing some physical ailments as well as bad nerves. Word of the face began to spread, which was now being called the Belmez Face, and soon the mayor wanted in on it. Instead of destroying the image by breaking the floor, professionals were sent to carefully cut the cement and remove the image. A team were sent to dig down into the dirt to see if maybe there was something causing this stain to keep coming back. The team dug, looking for clues. Soil samples were taken, but nothing unusual was found. Nothing could connect to the faces until they reached 10 feet. There were skeletons buried under the kitchen floor. Some of these skeletons were missing parts, such as their heads. The men carefully removed all the skeletons for examination. They discovered the bodies had been buried 700 years ago, long before any houses had been built in the area. They took the skeletal remains to the local cemetery, and they were all buried with a proper funeral. Having gotten to the bottom of the mystery, the floor was once more put in, and life got back to normal. As the Pereiras went on with their lives, soon things got kind of boring. Life would be dull after something like that. Well, a few weeks of boredom ended with the face beginning to form on the floor once more. Then, another face formed next to the first one. One face would seem to fade away as another formed in the new location. Some of the Belmez faces put on display were those of women and children. Apparently, by digging up the skeletons, it seemed to have the opposite effect that they had wanted. As word spread, it became an international story. German paranormal investigator Dr. Hans Bender said this was the most important case of the century. The Pereira family became a tourist attraction. Paranormal researchers, curious people, skeptics all began to descend on their home. Priests and spiritual leaders showed up wanting to exorcise or communicate with the faces. Many showed up proclaiming they knew what was going on, only to leave with more questions than answers. A full-scale investigation was launched. Samples of the concrete were sent to the Instituto de Ceramica y Vidrio for study. The ICV could find no evidence of any pigment, dye, or paint used, which ruled out a hoax. The remainder of the floor was carefully photographed in sections, and then they covered the whole thing with a tarpaulin, which was sealed around the edges. Finally, all the doors and windows were also sealed with wax. A German television crew filmed all of these precautionary measures with local dignitaries in attendance as well. Satisfied that nobody could tamper with the scene without detection, they left the kitchen alone for 3 months. When they officially unsealed the kitchen, the faces of Belmez had moved and evolved. None of the measures taken to prove this was a hoax were validated. None of the skeptics could make the faces go away or recreate any of them. A theory was formed. Something new was proposed. Thoughtography. The idea was, as people thought about seeing the faces, the concrete took on these mental images and made them real. As the researchers looked into this new possibility, one person's name kept coming up. When Maria was in the house, the faces were more active and darker than when she was away. Someone studied the features and they came to the conclusion that the faces looked kind of like Maria. A lot of backs were slapped, thinking they had found the answer, which to me it's just a bigger question. Maria Pereira was projecting the faces into the cement. This theory was shot down when, in February 2004, she died. The faces continued showing up, and they continued moving about the floor. The Casa de las Caras, or House of Faces, now functions as a museum. If you're in Spain and you'd like to see them, the address is Calle Maria Gomez, 5, 23568, Belmez de la Moraleda, Jaén, Spain. If you do go, send me some pictures. I'd love to see them. In the Forest of Lions, a historical monastery is home to several different spirits. Mortimer Abbey is said to be, drumroll please, one of the most haunted places in France. I wish folks would quit with the most haunted labels. There are literally hundreds of places all claiming to be the most haunted. Let's start a star system. 1 star means you might see something, and 5 stars means your grandmother will see something even if she isn't there. Having the most haunted designation isn't fooling most people, especially paranormal enthusiasts. Mortimer Abbey has spawned legends and myths of ghostly figures, curses, and death. Well, mort means death. A Mortimer means Dead Sea. During the 12th century, a Catholic religious order of monks and nuns called the Cistercians began to grow in influence. They branched off the order of Saint Benedict in order to pursue a life of simplicity, love, prayer, work, and self-denial. As their influence grew, they were gifted land by those in power, including the land where the monastery was built by King Henry I of England in 1134. The monastery was built in marshland, so the monks dug out a drainage pond in an attempt to dry the land. The water eventually stagnated, creating a dead pond, or mortemar, giving the monastery its name, Mortimer Abbey. After the death of his only son, King Henry I sent his daughter, Matilda, to live in the abbey so she wouldn't run around. You could say she was a bit wild. Matilda remained locked in her suite of rooms for 5 years. This did nothing to improve her attitude. She grew to hate both her father and the abbey. Once she was allowed to leave, Matilda went on to live for several decades. Upon her death, the folks in the abbey say her spirit returned. This is a common occurrence. Prisoners who spend years locked up in prison sometimes return to haunt their former home. This also sometimes happens with the guys who guarded them. The Mortimer Abbey is now home to the Lady in White, as she is seen roaming about the hallways and the rooms where Matilda was kept. Those that have seen her very much believe that this is the ghost of Matilda. as she is said to appear on nights closer to a full moon, moaning as she drifts through the ruins of the monastery. Those that have seen her, or know others that have seen her, say she can either be wearing black or white gloves. If she appears to you with white gloves, you're destined for good luck. But if she appears with black gloves, you will be cursed and you will die within a year. In the early 1500s, the monastery was at its peak, considered one of the biggest monasteries in the world, being home to over 200 monks. One night, a sick woman was brought to the monastery with hopes that the monks could help. Instead of being sick, the woman was possessed by the spirit of a wolf. This woman was a werewolf. In order to treat her, the monks chained her in a room. They conducted exorcisms for several days and nights. The exorcism was a success. Kind of. The woman was freed from the spirit of the wolf, and she walked out the door on her way home. The spirit that was lifted from her stayed inside the walls. Soon after the exorcism, the monks began seeing the shadow of a wolf creeping about the abbey at night. In the 1600s, the abbey began to decline. Many of the monks grew tired of living in such impoverished conditions. As the numbers were going down, the monks that chose to stay began to change their ideas. Maybe being poor wasn't such a good idea. They began to collect some wealth, which led to a bit more wealth, until the monks became quite rich. This caused the people that wanted to join their order to go elsewhere because they didn't see that as being proper. By the 1790s, the monks were living high on the hog. Their numbers were still declining until there were only 4 men left in the abbey. The French Revolution took place and the country changed. The revolutionaries stripped the churches and monasteries of their riches. The 4 monks at the abbey were locked in a tiny room where they eventually died. Once all the people living there were dead and the money was gone, the monastery fell into disrepair. The following year, with a new French government in place, Mortimer Abbey was sold as a national asset to a family named Duval, who then began selling off bits and pieces of the interior. Furnishings, wall decorations, things like that, even doors and windows. Mortimer Abbey sat abandoned once everything inside that was worth a dime was gone. Eventually, it was purchased by the Delarue family in 1863. They soon realized they were not alone inside. They saw shadows moving around from room to room at night. Doors and windows would open and close on their own, and paintings would be flipped around so they faced the walls. The family and their staff would hear footsteps moving around the building when nobody was up and about. The Delarue family sought help from the local clergy. They had become frightened of living in their own home, and they were hoping to get the spirits of the dead monks to leave. The local clergy tried several exorcisms until in 1821, when the family realized there might be something of a demonic presence in the home, something a lot worse than dead monks. When nobody could do anything about all the bizarre activity, the family moved out and Mortimer Abbey was once more abandoned. During World War II, an English paratrooper found himself surrounded by the enemy. As he huddled there in the dark, fearing for his life, A monk appeared from the forest and guided the man to the French resistance. When the soldier attempted to thank the monk, he vanished. Every owner since then has experienced some type of haunting. Sounds in the night, growls, moans, items slamming and then being thrown about. Some have reportedly seen the ghostly figures of monks or the White Lady floating around the grounds. There are also reports of other creatures roaming the grounds, including a huge wolf. People have captured wispy shapes with their cameras. Most believe this is the White Lady. The current owner of Mortimer Abbey embraces the legends as well as the ghosts. He offers tours of the grounds today. At one time, the St. Michael's Mount sat in a dense forest that spread far and wide. To this day, at low tide, the remains of ancient tree stumps are sometimes revealed. In those days, it is said that a giant, Cormoran, and his wife Cormorleon lived on the mount. A Cormoran lived on the mount even long after his wife was dead, and he would help himself to whatever he wanted, despite the local folks who wanted to keep it. He would regularly help himself to whatever he fancied, a herd of cows or a field of crops. When the locals decided they'd had enough, a young man named Jack went to the mount to seek revenge. Jack dug a huge pit at the base of the mount. He then blew a horn to wake the giant and began taunting him. A Cormoran came charging down the mount, intent on killing Jack. He fell into the pit and was killed. This is supposed to be the first account of Jack the Giant Killer. St. Michael's Mount seems to be haunted by giants. There have been sightings of what is described as being a particularly tall man. No one says just how tall this creature is, only that he is really tall. In the late 19th century, during work on the chapel, a small stone doorway was discovered in the south wall. Beyond this was a flight of steps leading to a small hermitage cell within which were laid the bones of a man who measured 7 feet 8 inches. It is believed the man was an anchorite, a type of a hermit, and his cell became a hidden tomb after he had died. There have been sightings of a ghostly monk walking around the mount. People also see a woman dressed in gray walking around. Both of these beings vanish as soon as they are spotted. The Gray Lady is supposed to be the ghost of a woman who became pregnant, but the father refused to marry her. The father of the baby, not her father. She jumped off the wall, killing herself and her unborn child. The waters around the mount are haunted by the spirits of Sarah Polgren and her lover, a sailor named Yorkshire Jack. Sarah wanted to run away with Jack, but her husband was kind of in the way. He had all the money, and she wanted it. Sarah poisoned her husband so she could inherit the cash and be free to pursue Jack. As soon as her husband was in the ground, Sarah was seen running around with Jack, and this raised suspicions. A closer look showed her husband had been murdered, and Sarah wound up the guest of honor at a necktie party. I forgot people listening who might not get the idiomatic references. She was arrested and hanged for murder. As she stood on the ladder about to die, Sarah asked Jack to promise he would marry her. Unwittingly, he did. Once Sarah was dead, Jack went back to being a sailor. He told his shipmates about his unwitting promise. That night, the sound of a woman's footsteps were heard crossing the deck. Jack suddenly jumped overboard. His body was never found. Fishermen hear voices coming from below the water if they get close to the mount. They also hear church bells ringing. There are no bells anywhere in the vicinity. When it comes to hauntings, Germany seems to lead the way. Some of the terms that we use today for ghosts come from Germany. A poltergeist is German for noisy ghost. A doppelganger means a double goer, a ghost that impersonates a living person. A roadway called the B215 that runs between Stedbergen and Dorverden, German words. I don't speak a word of German, even though my family originally came from there. Dorverden is known to have more accidents than any other road in all of Germany. There are more fatalities on the B215 between 2 and 3 a.m. than can be accounted for. People also report seeing a white lady walking along the side of the road. The faster the vehicle is going, the more likely they are to see this ghost. Some believe she is trying to warn folks to slow down. Others say she is there to collect the soul once the accident takes place. A Babenhausen barracks has been the home to both German and American soldiers. Today, it's a museum. People visiting have seen men dressed in World War II uniforms moving about the building. There are the sounds of boots stomping on the wooden floors when there's nobody in there. Lights have turned themselves on and off, and voices are heard giving loud orders, either in English or German, both. There's an old-style phone sitting on a desk. If a soldier there to see the museum should lift the handset, he or she will hear a woman speaking backwards. No one has been able to decipher what she is saying. The town was the site of a witch who was burned at the stake in the 19th century, and her ghost is said to have seduced and then killed several German soldiers since then. The White Lady of Bernkastel Kues Cemetery is seen with a long white dress floating from one tombstone to another. People seeing her have also heard her crying out in an unearthly voice. A hunter who encountered the White Lady was terrified by the ghost. He staggered back home and collapsed. His family took him to the Koblenz military hospital, where he suddenly awoke. He began rambling about seeing the ghost. His legs were swollen and he was running a high fever. As the doctors and nurses tried to diagnose his condition, the hunter died. The cause of his death was listed as unknown. A Citadel Spandau, or the Spandau Citadel, is in Berlin. The fortress was built in 1557 as a palace and a keep. It was also used as a prison in the 15th century. It was home to one lady who was the ex-lover of the ruler Hakim II. Her name was Anna Seidau, and Hakim's son was asked by his father to take care of her after he had passed away. Well, the son took it a bit literally, and he had her imprisoned in the citadel. She is said to haunt the place, being seen as a white lady. Rudolf Hess, the former deputy Führer of the Third Reich, had fled to Scotland. The British imprisoned him until the end of the war. Hess was found not guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. After all, he was locked up by the British before all of the concentration camp nastiness had taken place. He was convicted of crimes against peace and conspiracy. Hess was sentenced to life imprisonment and transferred, along with the other convicted war criminals that didn't get hung, to the Spandau prison in Berlin. September 29, 1966, all the war criminals were released from Spandau, with the exception of Rudolf Hess. Why he was kept locked up, we may never know. In 1979, a book called The Murder of Rudolf Hess was published. Former British Army doctor Hugh Thomas, who had examined Hess, asserted that the prisoner in Spandau could not be him. He assembled a lot of evidence as to why he believed this. The Messerschmitt Me-110 aircraft that Hess had flown to Scotland couldn't have flown that far. The prisoner refused to see his family for more than 35 years. Hess was wounded in the chest during World War I, but the prisoner at Spandau didn't have any scars to match the wounds. It was seemingly irrefutable evidence that the prisoner in Spandau was not Rudolf Hess. Regardless of the identity of the prisoner, he was found dead August 17, 1987, in the summer house inside the prison garden. Officially, it was ruled a suicide. Medical records say that Hess was way too infirm to have hanged himself, and the nurse taking care of him said the same. The nurse also attested that unknown men in U.S. Army uniforms were present at the scene, either before or after the death. I found many stories talking about people having seen the ghost of Hess. However, none of them mentioned dates or times or who the witnesses were. It's as if after his death, his secrets are still being kept. I might have to do an entire show on this one bizarre war story. Kahn Barracks, Schweinfurt, is the site of an old Nazi hospital psych ward. There's also a former Nazi dining facility that was used as the barracks for the U.S. Army. A soldier was asleep one night when he had a bizarre dream. He was lying on a table, and a Nazi doctor was looking down at him. There was a nurse standing next to the doctor who was covered in blood. The doctor said something to the nurse in German, and she placed her hands on his neck. The soldier felt as if he were choking, which caused him to jolt awake. It took him a while to catch his breath and get his heart under control. 2 years later, a second U.S. soldier, sleeping in the same room, had the same dream. He also saw the Nazi doctor and nurse. He also awoke after feeling hands choking him. After years in the military, the two men ran into each other. As they were comparing duty stations, the location of the barracks came up, which led to them sharing the dreams they had both had. The two men didn't know that the room where they had slept was right over the room where the dead were taken in order to be prepared for burial. Things happen during war that is beyond even being acceptable. One such incident was the bombing of Dresden. From February 13th to February 15th, 1945, during the final months of World War II, Allied forces bombed this historic city of Dresden, located in eastern Germany. The bombing was controversial because Dresden was neither important to German wartime production nor a major industrial center. The only reason given was to break the will of the German people to fight. By February 15th, the city was a smoldering ruin, and an unknown number of civilians, some say as many as 25,000, were dead. Back when I was a young man, my dad knew a woman who had been a young girl living in Dresden during the bombing. As she had some horror stories I probably was too young to hear, but I did anyway. Firebombs rained down on the city, and the center became an enormous inferno. A firestorm began. As fire burns up the oxygen, the negative pressure creates a suction. People were being sucked into the fire, slowly pulled to their deaths. The screams were heard for days. Those unlucky enough to not die from their injuries lay among the wreckage of the city, waiting for help that was a long time coming. Throughout the entire town, many have heard screams and moans of unseen women and children. It seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, lingering for a few seconds, and then it subsides. The area was home to a hospital during World War II where many women and children died during the attack. On some occasions, people have reported smelling burning flesh. The smell passes by, coming from just about everywhere. It lingers just long enough to be noticed before fading. A local legend claims that Johann Conrad Dippel, his ghost is seen at Frankenstein's castle near Darmstadt. Johann is seen most often between Christmas and New Year's Day, sitting on the roof of the chapel. Visitors to the castle have included numerous groups of paranormal investigators and ghost hunters, hoping to unravel the mystery surrounding the castle. I'll bet you thought Mary Shelley made the whole thing up. A dream, they said. In the late 1600s and early 1700s, Dippel was trying to invent a concoction that would prolong life, maybe even make a person immortal. The elixir of life. He moved into a castle that just happened to belong to a family named Frankenstein. Thus, Frankenstein's castle. Stories vary as to what happened. One says that Dippel was found out as experimenting on dead bodies that were stolen from the local cemetery. The folks in town descended on the castle and chased Dippel off into the night. In another story, Dippel was using some very dangerous chemicals, and he accidentally blew himself, along with a good part of the castle, sky high. Both stories do agree on the fact that he was conducting experiments on the dead. His ghost, and possibly the ghosts of some of his scientific experiments, are seen moving about the castle and the chapel. There's a ghost in Friedland Castle that just might do you harm. A beautiful young girl lived in the castle long ago. Her father was constantly inviting suitors to the castle, hoping one of them would marry his daughter. She snubbed every one of them. They were probably a bunch of old guys that were buddies with her dad. She was not interested in marrying any of the men her father was sending her way. As her father lay dying, he cursed her for being such a difficult person. Today, single men visiting the castle might run into a gorgeous young woman dressed as if from a time gone by. She looks like a tour guide or maybe an actress there to add to the atmosphere. When you spot the young lady, you are expected to behave properly or else. If you insult her or do anything she doesn't like, she'll leap onto your back and try to strangle you. As you gasp for breath, the ghost will vanish, leaving behind red marks on your neck and some stories that you can tell when you get back home. Let's nip over the border and visit Poland. They have some odd experiences as well. Built in the 13th century, Zephalka Castle owes its current design to Ernst Gutschau. The German entrepreneur bought the building in 1909 and he rebuilt it according to an 18th century designs. The castle looks just like what a castle should look. There are huge moats encircling the entire building. A bridge crosses so you can enter. As you're walking over the water, you might hear sounds like moaning or cries for help coming from below. In 1790, mourners had gathered to pay their respects as a funeral went by. The weight of so many people all crowded along the bridge caused it to collapse. People fell into the water below. There was more than just water down there. The castle dumped their sewage into the moat. Dead animals wound up there as well. The water was nasty, and the folks who found themselves thrashing about were mostly unable to swim. No one knows how many drowned that day, but the cries for help today make you think there must have been dozens, maybe even hundreds. There's a well found inside the castle walls that is also haunted. Cries and splashing can be heard from below. The wife of Hakim von Nichtes was in love with somebody, not her husband. When Hakim found out, he had her dropped into the well, where she eventually drowned. The child she had just born was bricked up inside the fireplace. Hakim didn't think the child was his. People standing near the fireplace have reported hearing a baby crying from inside the wall. Ernst Gutschau was not a nice husband. He had a trap door built into the floor of the bedroom. He sent several wives to their doom in the dungeon below. People hear crying and moaning coming from the floor of the master bedroom. Once more, there is a white lady in the castle. This is believed to be Gertrude, who lived in the castle along with her brother during the 15th century. A sibling rivalry led to an argument that led to a heated fight. Gertrude enlisted a group of Hussites to take her brother out, or, in other words, to kill him. The Hussites were a pre-Protestant Christian movement centered on the teachings of a Czech martyr named Jan Hus, who was burned at the stake in July 6, 1415, at the Council of Constance. Outraged by his death, the Hussites became a powerful force in Moravia, Bohemia, and parts of Poland. The battle was short-lived, and Gertrude found herself in the dungeon. Shortly after, her brother had her beheaded. Talk about sibling rivalry. People see a woman dressed in white roaming the halls as if looking for someone, maybe her brother. Liwa Castle is located next to the Liw River. L-I-W. I believe that's pronounced Liw. I don't speak Polish. The castle was once home to a castellan named Marcin Kuzinski. A castellan was a title used in medieval Europe for an appointed official, a governor of a castle and its surrounding territory, referred as a castellani. They were not royalty, they were just appointed. His wife, Ludwika, was said to be the most beautiful woman in all of Europe. Marson had an enormous ring with lots of jewels set in it for his wife. Probably more to show off to other people than to show off to his wife. One day, Ludwika told him she had lost the ring, so Marson had a second ring made, just a little more gaudy than the first, and he gave that to her. Once more, Ludwina said she had somehow lost the ring. People love to talk. They get some kind of a thrill telling tales on each other. Word began to spread that Ludwika had not lost the two rings, as she had given them to her lover. Marson heard what was being said about his wife. Somewhere out there amongst all of the visitors to the castle was a man more dear to his wife than him. In a rage, he had Ludwika drugged from the castle and beheaded. Her body was dumped into an unmarked grave. The following year, the gardener, working around the inside of the castle, found not one but two rings hidden in a magpie nest. It turned out Ludwika had set both rings on a stone while gardening, and the bird had swooped in and carried them back to its nest. The rings had been lost, just as she said. Marson was so overcome by grief that he killed himself. Instead of a lady in white, Ludwika is seen dressed in yellow. This had been her favorite color. The Ogrodzenik Castle is home to an unusual ghost. People have heard and seen a huge black dog running through the grounds, dragging a thick chain behind it. Some folks will only see the dog, while others will hear the sound of the chain. A few have experienced both seeing and hearing this ghost dog. The story behind the dog is that Stanislaw Wierzicki was an early 17th century owner and administrator of the castle. By enacting some underhanded business deals, Stanislaw accumulated a huge fortune. He piled his gold and silver away in a vault, not allowing anyone to touch it. He was a cruel and unforgiving landlord. His subjects feared and hated him. Those unlucky enough to work in the castle were treated little better than the animals in the corrals. As he grew older and was approaching the end, he refused to write out a will. It is said that when Stanislaw died, the devil refused to allow him into hell. Instead, the man was turned into a black dog and condemned to drag a huge chain for the rest of eternity. The dog is guarding the fortune which was no longer there. Once Stanislaw was dead, his son took over and he used the money as he saw fit. In 1908, the Zephalka Society for Poor Jews with Nervous and Mental Illnesses, that's quite a name, opened a sanitarium and a hospital in Otwock. Zofia Endelmanawa donated her jewelry to the hospital, and this is where the name came from. The first structure quickly filled, so an addition was built. As the population grew, more patients were sent to the hospital. Most of the folks going to the Zephalka were there to relax and recover from day-to-day pressures. Nervous disorders. Some were sent there by their families due to drinking or using drugs. Very few patients were actually locked up. By the 1930s, the sanitarium had 300 beds. At the outbreak of World War II, when Germany invaded Poland, the place was seized by the Nazis. In 1941, patients from different psychiatric hospitals were moved to Otwock. These patients were now mostly those who couldn't take care of themselves. Those with nervous conditions were no longer allowed. The hospital was filled with patients suffering from mental or physical deformities. The Nazis had some bizarre ideas when it came to who should live and who they could murder. Anyone incapable of functioning to better society was considered a burden. To free society from having the burden of caring for those incapable of caring for themselves, the Nazis came up with Action T4. The Nazi euthanasia program, codenamed Action T4, was the systematic murder of institutionalized people with disabilities. With a hospital full of folks who relied on others for the well-being, the Nazis simply murdered everyone there. The patients were injected with poison, and the bodies were left to rot. At the end of the war, the locals were allowed to clean out the bodies, many of whom there were no records of who they were or where they had come from. Once the building had been cleaned, it was refurbished to serve as a hospital once more. In 1959, the hospital was turned into a tuberculosis sanitarium. By 1998, it was once more used for psychiatric patients. With so many murders and deaths all in one place, it's no wonder that folks visiting the site today have seen and heard some unexplainable things. They see shadowy forms moving around the buildings. The sounds of screaming and moaning is heard in every part of the hospital. I often wonder if, once a person not in control of their mind dies, do they gain their sanity, or do they continue in the next world still suffering from their inner demons? From what folks have seen and heard at the Zephalka, some ghosts still hold on to their troubles. Insane ghosts. Now, does that sound scary? These spirits might be simply recordings of the energy caused by all of that suffering. As far as I could find, there is still no interaction with any of the paranormal investigators. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, tell your friends. Tell them what they're missing. Tell everybody that this is the best show. Well, you don't have to tell them that, but just let them know that I'm out here and I've got some interesting programs to listen to. If you have a subject that you'd like to see either in writing or something you'd like to have printed in a book, you can contact me at strangethings@arcanasa.com. I had a few more stories I was going to pass on, one from Malaysia, but I see that I've already hit the hour mark and, well, I'll save it for next week. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, the same murder three? Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.